Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees here and online. Welcome to another talk in the seminar series at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, English and Communication Department. Before I say anything else, one thing. First, I have classes here on Friday, so I try not to refer to you as guys and kids, okay? If I do, sorry, my mistake, apologies in advance. Next thing is that with our online audience, I would like to check whether they can hear me and they can see me. Could you please respond in the chat box? A yes or a thumbs up even is fine. It's okay. Good. Thank you very much. So it is October and we have another seminar here by Dr. Kathy Kim. When it comes to the introduction though, our one and only Dr. John Rogers is going to do the introduction because the invitation for the presenter actually came from him. So Dr. Rogers, please. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kathy Kim, a rising, if not risen star in the field of second language acquisition research. So Kathy, if I can call Kathy, is doing some very cutting edge research in the field of second language acquisition. I first met Kathy I can't remember how many years ago, but it was in Florida at a conference. I remember I just finished my PhD and Kathy was still doing her research. But I remember she grabbed me in the hallway and asked some really pressing questions that I could not answer at the time. And I remember this very clearly. Yeah. So to read from her bio, Kathy Kim, she's a clinical assistant professor of applied linguistics and director of the Second Language Acquisition Lab at Boston University. Her work focuses on contextual and instructional interventions that impact the development of explicit and implicit second language knowledge. She also investigates construct validity of psycholinguistic measures and is committed to advancing equity in quantitative research practices. She's won a number of awards for her research. This has included the Best of Modern Language Journal Award. She's also awarded several grants from the, for example, National Science Foundation grant, and her team's recent funded project is the first second language proficiency with multi-auto EIT. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Multi-auto EIT, an open access measure of oral language proficiency. She earned her PhD in second language studies from Michigan State University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathy Kim.
Thank you very much, John. So today, Dr. Kim is going to let us know or understand explicit and implicit L2 knowledge better by sharing us the results of a longitudinal research and web-based innovations. As the seminars go, we will have 45 to 50 minutes of the talk, followed by the QA. Our online participants, feel free to type the questions in the chat box, and then our participants here, I will take the questions later. Thank you very much. Dr. Kim, to you. Again, don't forget that online participants should see.
Right there. Should I sit right here? Okay. Thank you, Azar. Thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be here in Hong Kong and present my ongoing work and also most recent work that I've been doing on explicit and implicit knowledge interface. I have a lot to share with you, so I'm going to move forward quickly, but also in a comprehensive manner, I hope. So today I'll be talking mostly about the interface question, in particular, a very important question about measurement validity. And also with the measurement validity confirmed, I will be talking about the results that investigates the interface of explicit implicit knowledge. Unfortunately, I don't think I will have time to go over the web programmed implicit knowledge test, but I'll be happy to talk more about this after the talk if you have any questions. Okay. So contextualizing the question that is central to SLA and also my work, it is called the interface hypothesis. So I was born in South Korea, and my age of around 8 years old, my family all moved to the States. So I received US education where it was mostly content-based, meaning-based instruction. I was not given any form-focused instruction when I was young. And as a result, I developed a knowledge type called implicit knowledge, which is described as spontaneous, intuitive use of the language. So I was able to use the language quite fluently and also pretty accurately. And after 4 years of living in the States, our family all moved back to South Korea, which had a completely different education system. So there, I was not receiving content-based, meaning-based instruction, but I was receiving a lot of form-focused, grammar-focused instruction. So with this type of instruction, I developed a knowledge type called explicit knowledge. And you could think about your times of taking grammar classes. What do you learn in your grammar class? How third person singular S works in English grammar. So that was the type of knowledge that I gained. It is conscious and verbalizable use of a second language knowledge. And a question that is essential in second language acquisition and the interface hypothesis is, do the type of knowledge that we gain from grammar courses, which is explicit knowledge, influences directly the development of implicit second language knowledge, which is the type of knowledge that we typically want to gain to have a communicative competence. So this is a very simplified version of what an interface hypothesis is. I'll be talking a lot about implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. So I'll give you a definition of that. So implicit knowledge, again, is a tacit, unconscious knowledge of forms. And you could gain this mainly through exposure of rich input that does not have focus on forms. And access to this knowledge is rapid. For instance, at this very moment, I'm relying on my implicit knowledge because I'm not referring to any of my grammar rules at this point. Whereas explicit knowledge is conscious, verbalizable knowledge of forms. Again, you could refer to your grammar classes that you gained and the type of grammar knowledge that you have. You can gain this through instruction. And a lot of the times, access to this type of knowledge is slow and effortful compared to implicit knowledge or automatized explicit knowledge. So with this definition in mind, we want to think about what is the goal of language learning and what is the goal of teaching languages. We do want to develop both types of knowledge, but again, depending on what your goal is, but a lot of the times students learn languages to use the language in a spontaneous manner. So with the focus of implicit second language knowledge. So the question is, how can we develop this type of knowledge? This interface hypothesis, it has a lot of pedagogical implication, but is firmly grounded by theory and our cognition of language acquisition. It actually speaks to or is concerned of scope of adult L2 implicit learning. So for instance, as an adult, can we learn languages as we learned our first language as a child without awareness, without attention to the forms? And this topic has been very much investigated with a very clear positionality of scholars. Specifically, they take the multi-system view, in particular two-system view, where they claim that explicit learning mechanism and implicit learning mechanism operates parallelly at the same time. So for usage-based account, for instance, scholars like Nick Ellis would claim that explicit knowledge does have an impact on implicit knowledge development because explicit registration or noticing of linguistic form, it actually paves the way or permits implicit fine-tuning. Other accounts, especially those who were be claimed as non-interface hypothesis, they would say that, yes, there is an impact of explicit knowledge on implicit, but it is indirect. In other words, explicit practice generates implicit learning opportunities, which could in turn facilitate the development of their implicit registration. Okay. There has been a long history of theorization of this interface hypothesis, but compared to that, there is relatively little empirical investigation for very good reasons, because it's very challenging to measure implicit knowledge. That is the type of grammar knowledge without awareness of the forms. And also, in order to examine the direct impact of explicit knowledge on implicit, it has to be conducted in a longitudinal study, which has a lot of difficulties in conducting it as well. But I'm citing Jan Holstein here from 2005 paper. If we continue to focus on the conceptual and speculative aspect of theory constructs, neglecting the measurement issue, theories of implicit and explicit L2 learning will not survive. So it is important for us to really understand what is it that we're measuring through different types of measures, and what is do we have construct validity of them? And then we will need to proceed with addressing some important theoretical questions. So today, I'm being very ambitious because I want to introduce these two studies that I've been conducting in the past years and the most recent study. So yes, let's get started. So the first study is essentially on the explicit-implicit interface, and it was conducted as a longitudinal study. For those who want to take a closer look into the details of the study, this was published in 2023 by Lingualism and Language Cognition. So in this study, I had two research questions. The first one is the explicit-implicit interface. In other words, to what extent does explicit L2 knowledge influences the development of implicit L2 knowledge? And the second type of question was a little bit more pedagogically related. It was, to what extent do the types of activities, in other words, grammar-focused or meaning-focused activities, engage in naturalistic L2 context, contribute to the development of explicit and implicit L2 knowledge? So I was very interested in the type of language use that the students were doing during their studies in the US and how that impacted the development of these two types of knowledge. So I talked about the theoretical accounts of it. Very briefly, it has very strong pedagogical implications. It actually do inform teachers with pedagogical choices that is conducive to implicit and explicit knowledge development. So for instance, if we do not find a direct interface between these two types of knowledge, we could pretty much say that the instructional techniques with less involvement of explicit processing of rules is actually beneficial in developing implicit knowledge. So teaching methods and activities that would adhere to this account would be direct or natural approach, which focuses mainly on meaning-focused type of teaching, or communicative language teaching with less focus on forms. However, if we do find a direct impact or interface between these two types of knowledge, instructional techniques with more involvement of explicit processing of rules would be beneficial. Type of teaching methods or activities could be PPP, present, practice, produce, or communicative language teaching with more focus on forms. And this study was done with students who were international students in the US pursuing degrees. So it does speak to the benefit of studying abroad for a degree. So for instance, if we do see a knowledge type of development in the years that they were participating in the study, then it would suggest that those who are studying in the States do benefit from staying in the States and using the language. This is important for those in the US context because international students do make up 6% of the student body in the US, and language proficiency is found to be predictive or predicting the academic success of graduate and undergraduate students. Okay, now the methods. This was a 1-year longitudinal study. And in the first half, I will focus on the 2 time point. And this was the first study was conducted in the beginning of the year, January, February. The second time point data was collected after the first semester. And the third data point was collected at the end of the year. Participants who participated were 149 participants. Their TOEFL score, as you could see, was an average of 93.61, which means that they were fairly proficient English speakers. A lot of them were graduate students. A majority of the L1 was Chinese, but it came from very, very heterogeneous a group of participants. The type of structures that I examined were 6. 3 morphological and 3 syntactic. We intentionally selected this based on a couple of structures that were found to be acquired early in the language acquisition and also those in the later acquisition phase. Okay. So what did I use to measure L2 engagement, which was their measurement related to the RQ2? So I used a self-reported language exposure log. This was a way for me to more thoroughly collect learners' language use and language type that they use during their stay in the US. Very briefly, I collected a couple of different types of information from the participants. First was the type of language engagement. This was collected every hour segment from 6 a.m. to 3 a.m. So what they had to do was, for instance, in a mobile app, this is what you see. What type of activities did you perform at 6 p.m.? Choose all that would apply. Options would be speaking in English, writing in English, reading, listening in English. I was not using any languages or using native or other languages. After this, what they would need to select is a specific activity for chosen language engagement. So if they say, for instance, I was writing in English, what type of activities was it? Is it more of academic writing? It was more casual writing? And the last piece of information was the most important information for this study. So what was the focus of your engagement or the activity? Were you focusing mostly on form, or were you focusing on meaning when you were writing, or were you focusing both meaning and writing? So this was collected 5 times between time 1 and time 2. Yes, 5 times between time 1 and time 2. And this was throughout the different weekdays. So for instance, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So that was the L2 engagement measure that I used. Importantly, what did I use for implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge measures? For implicit knowledge, I used oral production, illicit imitation, and written time written GJT. For explicit knowledge, I used untimed written GJT and also meta-linguistic knowledge test. These measures were very carefully selected based on a very comprehensive construct validity study. One study that we published in SSLA was edited by Xiaofeng Li right here, and also Robert De Keyser on a special issue on implicit statistical learning aptitude. And I'll be very much happy to talk about that because it was a very, very good study. So these measures were selected based on that construct validity study. And importantly, what I did was for the 2 production-based tasks, and this was done before COVID, and at that time, there were no commercial softwares available that would allow for oral recording. So what I did was I worked with a computer scientist at that time, and he programmed these measures online. So these oral production and illicit imitation was programmed for participants to take this at the convenience of their home, and they would have to come to the lab later because they would need to complete the GJT MT task and MKT task. So for those who are at the seminar early in the morning from Dr. Rogers' talk, this was to prevent learners from relying on or finding answers on the web. For instance, what is in a metalinguistic knowledge test, what we asked was, explain why this sentence is ungrammatical. And they will need to give explanations of why third person singular S rule is wrong. So I wanted to prevent learners from relying on resources if this were to be done online. Very briefly, this is actually a video, but this is how the surface looked like. Students had to listen to a sentence. They would need to decide whether it's semantically accurate or not, semantically plausible or not, and they would need to repeat this sentence as accurately as possible. So we actually designed a manual for this for SLA researchers and also teachers without coding knowledge for you to implement this and use this in your research or in your teaching context. And this is available in Kim et al. 2024 appendix, and also a tutorial for auto-scoring linguistic accuracy that was based on the data collected through this measure is available in the research methods and applied linguistics, which Xiaofeng Li is the editor here. Okay, so what did I find in this 2 time point data? I will first take a look at the implicit knowledge results. So in general, I did find a significant improvement from time 1 to time 2, particularly with illicit imitation and oral production. For explicit knowledge results, I was able to also find significant improvement from time 1 to time 2 for both types of measures. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but you could already see that the oral production, there is a ceiling performance even at time 1, right? And I will be touching upon this later. So in general, there was an improvement in linguistic performance, especially in accuracy in all explicit knowledge tests and almost in all the implicit knowledge tests. On average, there was proficiency improvement after 3 to 4 months of immersion in the US context. However, on an individual level, I don't know if you could see it very well. You could see the lines connecting from box plot, the first one, and the second one. And this is all lines represent individual performance changes. You could see some going up, but you could also see some going down, which actually shows that there is some degree of improvement, but also there are a group of participants who actually show decrease. And for researchers and also educators, we're curious of why some participants are showing improvement and why are they showing decrease. Now, the first research question, is there an interface between from explicit knowledge to implicit knowledge? In order to examine this, I composed several models. So the model that you see right here is an implicit interface model where explicit knowledge at time 1 predicts the implicit knowledge at time 2. In order for this model to be valid, I wanted to see if this model was statistically better than the non-interface model. The difference between these two models is that there is no cross lag between explicit knowledge time 1 to implicit knowledge at time 2. Another possibility, which I did not intend to do when I was writing that NSF grant, but naturally arose when I was looking into the data, was the possibility of not only explicit knowledge impacting implicit knowledge, but also implicit knowledge impacting explicit knowledge. And we call this a reciprocal interface model. So what I did was I compared these models to see which model best explains the data of our international students' performance. And what I found was when I compared interface and non-interface model, what was superior? The interface. The reciprocal interface to interface, the reciprocal interface. Reciprocal interface with non-interface reciprocal interface. So as a conclusion, the best fitting model was the reciprocal interface model. With this established, now we want to take a closer look into the standard estimates of these predictive values. So the question in mind was, does explicit knowledge influence implicit knowledge? And we found that, yes, there was a significant prediction effect from explicit time 1 to implicit times 2. What was really interesting to find was an effect that was as strong as in magnitude from explicit to implicit, that is implicit knowledge from time 1 to explicit knowledge at times 2. In other words, those who have stronger implicit knowledge at time 1, they seem to gain a higher score of explicit knowledge after 3 to 4 months of studying in the States. For the research question 2, we were not able to find any significant prediction of the processing types on the 2 knowledge types. And indeed, what I also found was implicit knowledge predicting implicit knowledge, explicit knowledge predicting explicit knowledge, which we call this as autoregressive predictive path. It's a lot of information, but briefly summarizing the results and also discussion. So what we found was there is a general improvement with knowledge of grammar from time 1 to time 2. This was a gap between 3 months to 4 months. And the question in mind was, does explicit knowledge facilitate the development of implicit knowledge? And that was what we found, given that these measures are valid. So this adds empirical support to the causal effect of explicit knowledge on implicit. And what is unique about this study is this is one of the first longitudinal study that was done in this interface hypothesis question, but it also used natural languages. It also was explored longitudinally in a naturalistic context. So we really preserved the ecological validity there. The good news is it replicated findings from lab-based and also cross-sectional studies that were typically done in the SLA context. What was new was that implicit knowledge also facilitated development of explicit knowledge. So awareness not only facilitated implicit knowledge, but it also is a product of implicit knowledge. So this has a very strong implications for heritage language learners. So heritage language learners are those who have a lot of implicit knowledge, but they want to study the language later as an adult. So what they do is they start to take language classes and they would be learning grammar. So what this actually shows is that those who have a strong base of implicit knowledge, they have a better chance of developing explicit knowledge, which actually is a very good finding to see. But also, this is certainly not a perfect study, and it does have a lot of caveats. And this would be connected to what I will be introducing in the second half of today's research. And now I'm checking the time is 3:40. I'll try to make it fast. So we cannot completely remove the practice and the retest effects. So we would start to question how implicit are the implicit knowledge measures at time 2 and time 3, right? Given that they were taking this test, although with a time lag of 3 to 4 months, it is very likely that the implicit knowledge measures at time 2 is no longer implicit. So we really do need to test this. And as I showed you before, the oral production task showed a ceiling performance even at time 1. And this persisted at time 2. So it is susceptible to repetition effects. So a new analysis would be ideal with the OP measure removed. And while all of the measurement models were good, we want to make sure that the discriminability could be improved. So for instance, the factor scores that we use between the implicit and explicit knowledge construct, it was, both of them, the covariance was 0.83. This is below the threshold of danger of discriminative validity, but still, ideally, we want to replicate this with a more stronger evidence of discriminative validity. So what I did was I only included an ungrammatical item in order to differentiate these constructs more. Which leads to, and I'll do my best to move forward pretty quickly, into a study that I actually done fairly recently by revisiting this interface hypothesis with third time point data and also very thoroughly examining the measurement validity. So here I had two large questions. The first question was, again, on measurement validity. I will talk a little bit more about convergent validity and also discriminant validity, but convergent validity examines to what extent are the measures of explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge interconnected with their respective constructs. And discriminant validity is to what extent are the explicit and implicit constructs distinct from each other. 15 minutes, okay. And with the measurement validity confirmed, I wanted to retest that interface results. So with the revised set of tests designed to maximize the discriminant validity between the constructs, can I still find the reciprocal effect that I found in the 2023 paper? And as an extension, I wanted to add a third time point data to that cross-lag autoregressive model to see if that reciprocal interface effect proceeds into time 3. A very brief Stats 101 class right here. So convergent validity, again, it evaluates how well the measures align with the respective constructs. So you can see right here, this is a confirmative factor analysis model. So 3 tests was included that would estimate the measure of a construct, which could be explicit knowledge. And 3 tests could also be added to estimate the construct, the second construct, which we could say it is implicit knowledge. Convergent validity is that these tests show evidence that they are correlated enough, and to that it is representing this construct. And also these tests are intercorrelated enough to represent a construct of explicit knowledge. Discriminant validity actually suggests that these constructs are distinct enough to be showing uniqueness and they are not overly too interconnected, which is actually what we want to find. This is one way of approaching conversion and divergent discriminant validity. Another approach that you could take is compose a one-factor model where we will assume that all of these tests from test 1 to 6 actually will be loading onto one construct of linguistic knowledge. And what we want to see is compare these two models to see if the two-factor model is significantly better than the one-factor model. And we call that a model comparison approach. What is new about this study is I included multiple evaluation criteria to examine convergent validity and also discriminant validity. The convergent validity, I estimated 3 different measures. The standard factor loadings, that each factors are exceeding more than 0.5 of a correlation. So that would be estimated of a 25% of the variances of the construct. Composite reliability that would exceed 0.7, and average variance extracted, it will be exceeding 0.5. And I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about this later on. Discriminant validity, which was very important. I actually included, again, multiple evaluation criteria. First approach was model comparison approach. And the second approach is called the disattenuated correlation, which accounts for the error variation. So there were 3 different versions of this. And importantly, I bootstrapped the confidence interval to use to determine if the values were significantly suppressing the thresholds. Okay. So about the methods. So what did I make changes to the first study in order to make sure that the two constructs are relatively more distinct than what we saw before? As we saw, the oral production, it actually had a ceiling performance even from time 1. So, and we actually used the same test 2 times. So I decided to remove this item. With the untimed NGJT following rod analysis, I only included untimed ungrammatical items to, again, make sure that I maximize the discriminant validity of these two constructs. Very briefly, descriptive stats, what we see is, overall, there is an increase from time 1 to time 3. Now I added a time 3 data. Explicit knowledge, the medium to large effect size, implicit knowledge, small effect size. The scores of explicit knowledge actually was more successful to increase than implicit knowledge measures, which we would actually predict given that explicit knowledge is more favorable to repetition and practice. A little bit more about correlation. We are actually seeing good amount of correlation between the implicit knowledge measures and explicit knowledge measures. But I actually want to highlight this part, which is important. For time 3, untimed GJT, and time 3 MKT, what we're seeing is a sign of ceiling performance at time 3. This, you will see later, that affected the CFA model, which what this would imply is that the items of untimed GJT and MKT were too easy at time 3 when they were taking this test again after a year. Very briefly, convergent validity. What did I find? All model fit indices were acceptable, which is good to find. But with the time 3 untimed GJT, it returned a negative residual right here. So I fixed this factor loading to 1, but this already is a red flag, suggesting that this model is not performing well. Overall, the convergent validity was acceptable across all evaluation criteria. So the good news is these two tests that were loading onto each construct, they show fairly good correlation, which is what we want to find. So discriminant validity, again, to what extent are the two constructs distinct? This was, again, very important in order to revisit that interface hypothesis. I apologize for all the numbers. But essentially what this suggests is two-factor model for all time points were superior than a one-factor model. Okay. And I told you that I included more evaluation criteria for discriminant validity. What I found was this attenuated correlation actually found mixed results, unlike the model comparison results. In particular, the HTMT ratio says all factor CFA models are good. The construct correlation says that only time 1 and time 2 factor are good. The AVESV suggests that only time 1 and time 3 models are good. So we're actually seeing mixed findings. But what I want to highlight right here is that the time 3 model, actually the covariance or the correlation between these constructs exceeds the recommended 0.70 threshold statistically significantly. So what is important here is that we're not only looking at the average number right here, we want to make sure that this is statistically different from the threshold of 0.7. And right here, you can see that the lowest confidence interval is above 0.711, suggesting that there is a risk of discriminant validity violating in time 3. So putting everything together, given that I actually had to make adjustment to time 3 CFA model by fixing the factor loading to 1, and also seeing that the construct correlation is significantly above 0.7, I decided to conclude that time 3 CFA model is not a valid model, and I did not include that into the final analysis. But this means that I could still replicate the Kim and Godfrey 2023 model. What I did was I was able to replicate both cross-lag path, which confirms that given that these measures are valid, we are seeing interface of explicit and implicit knowledge in a longitudinal context. Azar, how am I doing with time? 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. Discussion. I examined the measurement validity. This was actually revisiting with the data point that we already published in the BLC paper to ensure that the findings that we reported are actually what we are claiming that we are claiming. Conversion validity was fairly well established, which means that two accuracy-based morphosyntactic measures seem to be tapping reliably well into each construct. But what was interesting to find is that the discriminant validity, it is not as clear-cut. We found very, very mixed results, which is summarized right here. But what I want you to take a look into is this two valent point. The mixed results of each evaluation criteria suggesting different findings, it actually highlights the complexity of assessing discriminant validity, especially in the context of explicit and implicit knowledge research. But what I did find quite informative was that the disattenuated correlation approach provided more nuanced understanding of the model fit results. If I only relied on the model comparison results, I may actually have it may have led into some undesirable results and conclusions. So I would say that it is very important to be including multiple conversion validity measures and also discriminant validity measures when we are examining construct validity. Talking a little bit more about the discriminant validity, given that this was an important topic, what I found was that discriminant validity of these two constructs decreases as time goes by. So we found that time 1, discriminant validity was valid. We were able to establish that, but time 3, it was not valid. But keep in mind, it was the same measure, but of course the items were all different. It was the same measure that was taken at 3 different time points. What I am speculating is that there's a steep increase of metalinguistic knowledge test scores at time 3. So at time 1, the average score was 0.36, but at time 3, how much was it? 0.77, right? And that's a big jump. What it's doing is it actually landed fairly comparable scores across all tests at time 3. So you can see that EIT, GJT, and also MKT, it's around 0.6 and 0.7. What actually that does statistically is that it actually obscures the variances which is necessary to see any discriminant validity. Whether the increase of the MKT test was due to repetition, it is not clear, but the gap between time 2 to time 3 was fairly substantial, which is 6 months. And a lot of the students were actually going abroad because it was the vacation. But what I would really like to highlight for those who want to do longitudinal study in explicit and implicit knowledge is that there is a clear need for extra items and target forms. So for instance, Rod Alice included 70 target structures, whereas in my study, I only included 6. That are more difficult, but can still differentiate between proficiency levels. That means it is not too difficult for all participants, but at the same time, it is differentiating between those who are beginning level and also advanced level. And I would like to highlight that construct validity of explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge tests, they vary in important ways. There's a recent finding done by Rio Mai and also Linga for showing that proficiency level leads to how they are processing timed GJT and untimed GJT. We're also seeing that learning context matters in terms of the validity of these types of measures. And also, the inclusion of the tests in the CFA model makes a significant differences in terms of what we are finding in the model fit indices. For instance, those tests that include reaction times and the untimed accuracy tests would have different results of tests that are solely including reaction times or solely accuracy-based measure, which is very natural because the CFA model is a variance covariance model. And what I'm seeing right now is the effect of frequency or time. The same test, again, with different items within the test, were given 3 times, and we are seeing that at the time 3 point, the CFA model is no longer valid. I think I only have 2 slides left. For RQ3, which was, I wanted to revisit the validity of the interface effect that was reported in our 2023 BLC model, BLC journal paper. Generally, there was a performance improvement from time 1 to time 3. There were a larger performance increase for explicit knowledge measures than implicit knowledge measures, again, which was what we would typically expect. I was able to replicate the reciprocal relationship between these 2 types. So explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge were shown mutually beneficial in developing an overarching knowledge of linguistic competence or linguistic knowledge. They're both helping each other to perform a better representation of knowledge. However, I would like to emphasize again and again that we need to have a replication and validity study that includes tests with more distinct constructs. I was able to establish that there were distinct enough, but taken that discriminant validity could be conceptualized as a continuum, not a binary construct. We want to make sure that we want to find the same study results with tests that showed more distinctiveness between these constructs. I would like to emphasize that this was evident only for time to 2-point window. To what extent the effect persists with more data point is to be discovered. This was a point that I really was looking forward to in my data analysis, but unfortunately, given that the CFA model at time 3 was not valid, I was not able to examine that. But this is a good project for our future PhD students. The interface effect was found with highly heterogeneous group of participants, again, primarily advanced L2 English speakers. This is the last slide. Okay, so I would like to end this presentation by giving a lot of recommendations and what I learned through this longitudinal explicit and implicit knowledge measure and the interface hypothesis. I would like to emphasize that construct validity of explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge measures are indeed time dependent, and this will be pretty much the case for any measures that we do. But the linguistic knowledge increases with time, so it is important to have diversity of item difficulty and target forms included in the longitudinal explicit implicit research, even starting from time 1. So we need to have a wide range of difficulty items when we are designing, especially longitudinal research. And as I demonstrated, and hopefully it was convincing, it is necessary for us to include multiple assessment of criteria for convergent validity and discriminant validity tests. It was particularly found effective especially with the discriminant validity in discerning the degree of distinctiveness of the construct. We really ought to move away from saying that, yes, this is discriminantly valid. No, this is not valid. Unfortunately, research is not that clear cut, and human beings are very complex in a very beautiful way. We will not be able to say yes or no. And I would really like to emphasize that. I would like to leave this talk with an importance of making sure that the measures that we use in SLA research is rigorous. So in order to do and examine the development of L2 or acquisition of L2, we need to have good measures that are reliably measuring what we are supposed to be measuring. And this has to be tested every single time you're using that measure. So that is the message that Luke Plonsky has been delivering in his talks, which is called the SLA assessment interface. So I would like to close with that message. And I would like to thank these two individuals, Aline Goffroyd, who has helped with the design of this study, and also Mark Brisberg, who has provided a lot of insightful feedback on the measurement validity and also some cautionary notes that we should be providing to SLA researchers. Thank you.